Good evening. My name is Brian Belinsky. I'm the president of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. And thank you for joining us this evening. First of all, the SCSW would like to thank the Czech Embassy for hosting this event and the American Circle of Washington, D.C. for their co-sponsorship. Tonight's event kicks off the 14th year of the SCSW's Speaker Series. Please visit our website, dcslovaks.org, to find out more about our upcoming speakers and other activities. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Kimberly Zarecor, is an associate professor of architecture at Iowa State University. Her research examines the cultural and technological history of architecture and urbanism in the former Czechoslovakia. Her book, Manufacturing a Socialist Modernity, follows the development of mass housing in post-war Czechoslovakia and examines the relationship between communism and architecture. The SCSW is pleased to present Dr. Kimberly Zarecor.
So I've turned the podium a little bit because I like to be able to see my slides. I'm used to having my laptop here, so we're going to see how this goes. So first of all, I just really want to thank everyone for coming. It's a great crowd. And for me, it's always a pleasure to talk about my research. You can imagine you spend a lot of time working on projects like this. This was a 12-year project from start to finish, including learning Czech language in order to do it. And you don't always get a chance to talk to a really interested audience. So for me, this is fantastic. So in order not to spend too much time introducing everything, because I can talk forever about my book, I want to first thank Helen Fedor for making sure that this happened. Helen first invited me, I think probably 2.5 years ago, something like that. And in that time, I have 3 little kids, and 2 of them have been born in the last 3 years, so there was just no way for me to get to Washington. So Helen was very great to just make sure that we did this, and we figured out a way. And so I'm just thrilled to be here. And this is a topic, as you just heard, that doesn't get a lot of attention, or it did not in the past. It is now a very hot topic for those of you who know anything about what's going on in Prague, in the Czech Republic, in the former Eastern Bloc. There are these legacies of the communist period, physical legacies of the city that are part of the world that they live in still, and so there's a question of what to do with it and how to think about it. And Sídliště and Paneláky right now are actually popular, and people are moving there with their young families. They're well connected on public transportation. The public spaces have been fixed up. If anybody's been to Jižní Město recently, it doesn't look anything like it did 20 years ago. And this is exciting for somebody like me who's put all this time into the topic. When I first started this research, I would get very looks of curiosity, like, what are you talking about? You're going to write a dissertation about the history of Paneláky. This seems to people to be very strange. And now I think that that's not at all the attitude, and that the existence of this kind of research has opened up a really new and interesting conversation in the Czech Republic and other places. So I feel pleased that it's had that kind of effect. So the name of the book is Manufacturing a Socialist Modernity, Housing in Czechoslovakia 1945 to 1960. And I'm going to just position myself so I can see what I'm going to be talking about. So this first image is the model of the very first Paneláky that was ever built in Czechoslovakia. The model is dated to 1950. It's a model that has an interesting character, which is that not only do you see the apartment building, but you see the gantry crane construction of the apparatus needed in order to put the panels together. So when they modeled this building, they didn't just think about the building, but they thought about the construction technology integrated with it. This building was eventually built in Zlín, and I will show it to you. So my book was published now in 2011, almost 6 years ago, which is, for me, hard to imagine, but is true. So on the left, you have the English language version. This is the University of Pittsburgh Press book, and we had some flyers if you're interested to buy the book on a little bit more about it. And then in 2015, Academia Press published a Czech translation. So any of you who prefer to read in Czech, I encourage you to take a look at that. It was translated by a wonderful translator who's also trained as an architect. And so I think it's probably one of the best translations in the series. This is in the Šťastné, zítřky series from academia, which I love the title of, which is Happy Tomorrows. And it's the cultural history of communism. And there's amazing books in that series by Czechs and also by foreign scholars in translation. So I want to talk a little bit about the construction of my research. So this was my PhD dissertation. I learned Czech and I studied Eastern European history and architectural history at Columbia University. And I think that one of the challenges of the work is what kind of questions do you want to ask about Panelaks? You know, how do you even start? So this is the research question I formulated for my dissertation that became the book. How and why did the Czech architectural profession move from the style of 1930s avant-garde social housing to prefabricated concrete panel buildings in the late 1950s and after? So it was a question about continuities and discontinuities, and this was important to me, not to tell the story of communist architecture as if it started from a 0 point in 1945 or 1948, but to actually understand that what happened after 1945 is absolutely connected to what happened in the 1930s in particular. So I have here a typology of housing. Just some of you probably know a little bit about this. I was talking to some of you already about your interest in urbanism. And so we have the 1930s social housing that came about during the Great Depression by architects Hilsky, Jasensky, Jech, and Kuželka. This was a project in Prague to do minimum dwelling units, you know, apartments that were minimum standard but had everything that you needed. And this is the model of the social housing that groups like SIAM, the international avant-garde, were really trying to get put into place, more architecture built like this in the 30s, all over Europe in particular. And this was a Czech example. But then after the war, what we see in the Czech government is a really systematic push to build more housing and to build housing that was done in a way that could be repeated, that could be standardized, that the government could get quality housing quickly and all over the country using these same models. So what I'm showing you here is the 1949 T1 series building. So some of you may know that Czech buildings, Czech sídliště, the buildings inside of them, they often have a number. So if you lived in one of these, you probably knew what your number was. The very first series was the T series, 1949. The first experimental building was T1, so that's what you see here. Then in the 1950s, you have Ostrava, Poruba, and socialist realism, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then here we have the building site in Prague that is on the cover of my book. That is the first time that Panelaks were built in Prague. There had already been some built in Zlín, but this is the first building site in Prague. The street is called Zeleno Liško. Some of you may know this. It's in the Pankratz area. And these were built near other experimental housing actually from the 30s, which is really interesting. If you go to that neighborhood, you're going to find social housing examples from the 30s. And it was a kind of designated space to try out different kinds of housing types. And they built all these first Panelaks there around 1957. Then we have Praha Kirch, Kalosh, 1960s. This is the kind of high point of 60s modernism when things, at least in photographs, you can really see the beauty of the high modernism, the kind of international style, the desire to be, to have buildings that look very much like what was happening in other parts of the world at the time. And then we have the period in which the production ramps up in terms of numbers of buildings, but the quality tends to go down in terms of construction, and the sites become denser, and materials become more scarce, and the overall knowledge base starts to fade a little bit by this time, because you no longer have the architects working who were trained in the interwar period. You're sort of losing a generation as you come into the 70s. And some architects also stepped away because of the politics of post-1968. So the people who were still working at that time, some of them were given a hard time about it. So you have this project. This is Petržalka in Bratislava. And this is what it ended up looking like when it was built in the 1970s and 80s. But the original competition for Petržalka was actually 1966. So it kind of crosses over this period between before and after 1968. So in my research question, in the framing of the research, the question is, how do you go from this kind of architecture from the 1930s, 1920s, the avant-garde. This is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe's Tugendhatvilla in Brno, where the architect's position in the project is as the author and also as an artist. And this is an individual house. It's a very specific site. It's a specific client. It's a one-off house. In this case, very luxurious house. But I'm using it just as an example of the kind of architectural practice that architects aspired to in this time period. And after the communism, this is the kind of architecture that people started to build. So here we have Petržalka. This is towards the end of the period, as I said, where the architect is part of a collective designing repetitive, serialized buildings that are, sorry, this has a spelling mistake, produced through industrial methods. This is Talas and a team at Stavoprojekt. So what I'm contrasting is not only the formal way that the building looks, but actually the position of the architect as a professional, as an expert in this context of how the state intervenes in architecture. So what I'm going to do tonight is try to give you a synopsis of the 5 chapters that are in my book. And very quickly, I'm just going to tell you what the chapters are. So in chapter 1, it's about the period from 1945 to 1948. And it's about how, after the war, architects mobilized very quickly. In fact, within 3 weeks of the liberation of May 1945, the architects were already meeting. They were already making plans. The socialist architects had already reconvened. They were getting ready to promote the nationalization of architecture. This is before there's a communist government. Architects were very left-wing. They believed the state needed to be their clients. And so they wanted the state to get behind architecture. So they got what they wanted in one sense. So then the second chapter is about the creation of Stavoprojekt. And any of you who know about architecture in post-war Czechoslovakia, Stavoprojekt is the umbrella organization in which all of the architecture happens. Some architects worked as in-house designers for national firms, but most architects worked in the Stavoprojekt office. And this chapter is about the creation of Stavoprojekt, its framework, what it was trying to do, especially in the early period, which is a little different than what happens a few years later. Then I have a pair of chapters that deal with socialist realism, or Sorela, which is the Czech word for this. And what I decided to do was one chapter that's about the idea, the method, the relationship to the Soviet Union, the kinds of differences that we see in the Czech and Slovak case. And then the 4th chapter is a study of an individual architect. His name is Jiří Krouha. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he was a fascinating character. He was an avant-garde modernist in the 1920s. He was a friend of Tage and Grzyzowski and Jakobsen, and he hung out with these linguists and all of these avant-garde guys. And he was always a very dogmatic communist. And this led him to become the regime architect for Gottwald. He designed the stages and the sets for the party congresses. He did buildings for the state. He designed the display of the catafalque after Gottwald died. And he has a very interesting history because he's this regime architect, but then he gets denounced and his office gets closed and he becomes an enemy in a sense. So I tell the post-war story of Krouha's career with a little bit about the beginning of his career, but I situate him within the conversation about socialist realism. And I also talk about him as a figure who shows how complicated the relations were between architects and the state. And the final chapter, which for me is the one that I think makes the biggest contribution to the knowledge base in architecture, is kind of the climax of the book, is this 5th chapter, which is about the history of the Panelák itself. And what my research shows is that the Panelák is a technology that was developed by Batia architects in Zlín. It's not a Soviet technology. And in fact, the Soviets never used the Czech version of the technology. They bought their technology from the French. And so this is the story of how Batia, as a capitalist interwar company, somehow becomes the model and the basis for Stavoprojekt and later for the Panelák. And the evidence is irrefutable of these links. So sometimes people are a little shocked that I would somehow link these two things. But it's really a story about technology. It's about architectural technology and people pushing the field of architecture forward towards, mechanization, prefabrication. And Batia already had all of these capacities within its organization. So let me start with chapter 1. So here we have in 1946, Oldřich Starý in the front here with representatives of BAPS meeting with the president, declaring their support for the government and saying architects are ready to work for the government, and they present themselves basically as ready to serve. And here we have BAPS, which in Czech you can see Blok architektonických pokrokových spolků, in English the Block of Progressive Architectural Associations. And what these were all the professional organizations that represented the interest groups across the profession. They got together under one umbrella. Leading this charge were the socialist architects, the SSA, and these architects were setting the professional context. So not only is my research about architecture, it's also about professional practice. So within this group, we have three really important characters. We have Karl Janu, Jiří Sturza, and Jiří Boženílek. And in the 1930s, these three architects were part of an avant-garde collective that was called the Architectural Working Group, the Pracovní architektonická skupina. They were disciples of Karl Teige, the provocateur, critic, artist, they call him the enfant terrible of the Czech avant-garde. He, in the 30s, was promoting this concept of scientific functionalism. And these guys picked it up as young university students, and they had I don't want to call it a practice, but this collective that did projects in the 1930s. And here you can see Janu as an older guy, this is Boženílek as a younger guy, and this very fuzzy, only photo I've ever seen of three of them together. This is the Architectural Working Group. The reason that they're so critical is that the three of them make major contributions to the establishment of Stavo Projekt, to the creation of post-war practice, and also one of them designs the foundations of the Stalin Monument. So here's Janu's details. He worked at the Osidlovací úřad during the war, which was the agency, just after the war, the agency that was resettling people in the borderlands after the Germans had been kicked out. And he was a prominent figure in this office in which being communist was a big benefit. So this was run by the Ministry of the Interior, the Osidlovací úřad, and it put him in contact with some important people. And this is one reason that he's picked to lead what's called the Czechoslovak Building Works. It's basically all of the construction industry and all of the architects. So the Osidlovací úřad, this resettlement office, was critical, and he also wrote books about building apartments in the borderlands. He was bringing a kind of architect's perspective. He becomes the first head of the building works in 1948. This is a corporation, a national corporation that was the nationalized building industry. So they took every building industry company, they put them under what I call an umbrella of the Czechoslovak Building Works. It only lasts for a few years, but it's a critical moment because you had the state organizing this sector of the economy. 1951, he is pulled out of his role at the Building Works, which is dissolved and it's a different structure after that, and he studies housing prototypes and building technologies at a Stavo Projekt Research Institute. So essentially he's pushed down, he's quieted down, because that's the same time that socialist realism is ascending in the official discourse, and he and Boženílek won't get behind it, so they're kind of hidden. But after 1956, he's appointed the minister to be a deputy minister of building. So the Ministerstvo stavebnictví, which didn't exist before 1956. It had different kind of names. So in other words, immediately the Khrushchev thaw, he's picked back up and put in an extremely high administrative position. So Jiří Sturza, he has a little bit of a different history. Some of you may know him. He's the nephew of Jan Sturza, the sculptor. And he was the author of two housing developments in the Model Housing Development Program, which happened between 1945 and 48, and I will show you a little bit about that. In 1950, he designed with his wife, Vlasta Sturzová, he designed the plan and the architectural foundations for Spets's winning entry to the Stalin Monument competition. And I just was doing a review of a book about that competition, and I think we should really think of the three of them as a team. And even though the architects were not doing the sculpture piece, they were very much, they were hardline communists, they were longtime party members, even back into the 30s, and they really were enthusiastic about the project. From 1952 to 54, he's the director of the architecture department at ČVUT, which is the technical university in Prague. So if you know what was happening in the country in 1952, you realize that this is a person whose political affiliations and position might be contrary to one that we would think was a good position. I mean, he's head of the architecture department during the show trials and all of that stuff. So he was considered safe in that way. And he stays on for many decades as a professor, but he's not the chair after, or he's not the head after 1954. So he is in the architecture department at the hardest moment when the government says you have to do socialist realism, you don't really have a choice. So he's a political operative in that sense. And so here we have Jiří Voženilek, who's maybe the most important of the three for my work. He is here. Does this have a little laser on it? So in the middle of this picture is Jiří Voženilek with his fingers on this map of Gottwaldov, and sitting next to him is President Klement Gottwald. And he is showing the plan for the new design of Zlín, which had been renamed already in 1948 to the town of Gottwaldov, or city. So why is Voženilek here? So he's part of the architectural working group, but in 1937 he accepts a job in Zlín for Batia, which is an unusual kind of move because he's in this left-wing avant-garde collective. There's no real knowledge about why this happened. I have a theory that it just has to do with needing to be employed and stable. He had 4 kids. I happened to find that out in the archive. So I think he went there for some stability. So he goes there in 1937, and he becomes a leader in the left-wing resistance in Zlín. During the war period, he was not a party member, though, which is different than the other 2 guys I talked about. In 1948, his old friend Karl Janu takes him from Zlín, directly from Zlín, says, we are going to hire you to be the head of Stavoprojekt, the first director, and we want you to bring all the things that you know from Batia to Stavoprojekt. And I have all these documents that show all of these connections. So he was forced out in 1950 by Jiří Kroha and some other people who were in the leadership of Stavoprojekt as the executive council, when he would not make Sorella the kind of official style, when he didn't show enthusiastic support, so they took him out. And they made him the director of something called RUVA, the Research Institute on Architecture and Urbanism, which lasted for a very long time, and if I ever have a chance to do another deep archive project, I would love to do something about this institute. But he's doing research, and it's the same thing that happens to Karl Janu. And then when Karl Janu becomes Deputy Minister of Building, Jiří Voženilek is picked up as the Deputy Minister of the State Committee for Construction, which is an affiliated group, institution. And then in the 1960s, he becomes the head architect of Prague. And so people in Prague really know him as a bureaucrat. He was not a designer when he was in that position. He was sort of a project manager for the whole city. But he has a little bit of a personal reputation for being not a great guy. For me, the interesting thing is just all of these places that he was over all of this period and how much Batia plays into the future. So the very first building that was built, finished and built, and not even finished, you can see it's not even finished in the picture, was in Zlín after World War II. In the period of the second half of 1945 and all of 1946, there was not new architecture happening, new buildings. The first building that opens is actually by Vladimir Karfík, the architect who also was the famous Batia architect who then moved to Bratislava and was a founding professor at the Bratislava architecture department. But here's the Fučík Quarter, the first building that's almost finished, and they had this big celebration for the opening of this first new building, and they printed this picture of it in 1947 in the architecture journal Architektura ČSR. So the other thing that's happening at this time is a competition for what kind of architecture is going to be the architecture of the post-war state. And we have one last great avant-garde project that happens in this period. This is by 2 architects, Václav Hilský, Evžen Linhart, who themselves are interesting. They were different generations and they were put together. We think the theory is that Václav Kopecký, who knew Linhart from childhood, who was the Minister of Information, we think that he put them together as a team, but they both were big fans of Le Corbusier. So you have one older architect, one younger architect. Hilský was one of the architects of the social housing project I mentioned in the first slide. So you have these 2 architects, one more senior, one more junior, but they're big Le Corbusier fans. And there's a RFP, a request for proposals, that is put out by the, one of the companies that is in the brown coal basin in the northwest part of Bohemia. And this is in Litvinov, if you know the area. And they wanted to build a collective house. Originally, the plan, in fact, was for 35 collective houses. This is kind of an amazing thing, but they reduced it down before the call went out to just be one. And it had very specific parameters. This is a fascinating story, just this one building. The Nazis were occupying this place during the war. There's in Litvinov a huge Nazi housing district called Osada, if anybody's been to Litvinov. And they had used that as barracks, partly as barracks. There was the Nazi housing for the administrators, but then there was also for the slave labor, they had barracks. And when they wanted to get the chemical plant that's in the valley below here running again, they needed workers and they needed somewhere to house them. So the first idea was to build 35 collective houses. They start with one, and it has, I think, 800 units. And the call for proposals went out, and they received proposals from all of the great modern architects who still were around. Pretty much everybody in the Czech context, almost all the architects survived the war and showed back up. So the RFP, the request, had this one stipulation that's very interesting, which is that it could not be a building parallel to the hill. This is there are mountains above here, the Krkonoše, and this building sits at the ridge of the top of the basin and the bottom of the mountain. It's on a it's literally on a ridge, and they thought that if they put a big building parallel to the ridge, it would create what's called a microclimate. It would cause problems with pollution, and that it would cause problems with the environment around the building. So the architects were told that whatever design you do, you can't do a single building, you have to do several, and they have to have this opening between them. Not everybody listened, but these guys did. So they have two sets of apartments, and in the center, there is a hostel for single men, sort of like a hotel, and then there's a daycare center, a dining room, a library, all these shared communal services. And the apartments are small but livable, and some of them are actually 2 stories. But the idea was to create a self-sufficient community in this collective house. And it was built more on the Scandinavian collective house model than on the Soviet one. So the apartments are not very, very tiny, but they don't have a full kitchen. They just have a little stove to heat up food because you were supposed to get your food in the dining room or have it brought up. It never worked out that way. They ended up turning it into a restaurant where you had to pay for the food. But there was this collective idea. Another thing that happens in this period are government-sponsored moderate housing developments. This is paid for with United Nations development funds after the war, and they do 3 of these projects. And this is a demonstration of what socialist architecture might look like. Okay, so here we have the one in Ostrava. Here are some of the buildings. There was a competition for these, and the winners included a team to do the master plan. But also they had 2 architects whose buildings that they selected. One was Anna Friedlova, whose husband is Evgen Friedl. They were both architects. And she did these very nice modernist inspired buildings with winter gardens and kind of glass balconies. And these are an idea about what socialist architecture could look like before you actually have a communist government. So here we have a renovated one of these buildings on the left, and still unrenovated, no longer the case if you go to Ostrava. Almost everything is renovated, but here we have what it looked like in about 2002, 2003. And you can see the winter gardens, so you would have plants out there. So they're designed very generous apartments, 80 square meters, and they were meant to be housing for working class people, but new housing. And the idea was that the models would be repeated, and they never were. There were just 3 of these. And then communists come to power, and that project is basically ended. So here we have Stavba-projekt. It's established in September 1948. This is a picture that's put in to the journal Architectura ČSR, showing the enthusiasm from the working class for the construction guys for Stavba-projekt. And the working model of Stavba-projekt is borrowed from interwar concepts of nationalization and a collective model of practice. And this was really promoted by BAPS, by this block of architectural associations. There's books already about this in the 30s that Janu and the Architectural Working Group guys wrote. And so this is a fulfillment of a dream, so to speak, where the state becomes your stable, permanent client. and architects do not have to go looking for work, because if any of you are architects, you know one of the problems about architecture is it's a service profession. You can't make anything if somebody hasn't hired you. So their idea was, if the state is our client, then we have unlimited, essentially, potential to build architecture. So there are 8 principles to Samopprojekt, and I'm going to go quickly because I know I'm already talking too long. So typification, modularization, industrialization. You can see here prefabrication. Here we have what was in the journal in this first issue to show you what they're after. On the left we have the industrial workers' settlements, which is a capitalist chaos in the language of the architects at this time, versus what they call natural typification, which are Slovak cottages, and many of you know the Slovak cottage was always thought of in this idealistic way. Here it's shown as a repeated building type that is essentially perfected and then repeated, and there's no reason to change it because it's already really good. So you have the natural typification, and then you have the kind of barracks-like chaos of capitalism. There's also typification models coming from places like Japan. Here we have an illustration from Architectura ČSR showing Japanese tatami mats as one way of thinking about modular proportions. And then we also have Zlín, which is the great example of using a module across all kinds of architecture. So the other thing that was happening is that more than any other country, this chart, those of you who know Czech can read this, but its chart is, first column is Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Denmark, Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, Holland, Finland, Czechoslovakia. And what this chart is showing is what kind of building types were in use in the country, because this is about how much you can repeat the same building. The only thing I want you to see in this chart is that of all of the countries in this chart, Czechoslovakia is the one with the fewest building types in use. You can see that the column for Czechoslovakia has one in dark ink and one in dashed lines, dots, which means that essentially only the row building, the Žadový, this was the only type that was being used, these kind of long buildings. And they didn't really have any examples of these other ones. Point kind of buildings, tower buildings, very few, palace types. These other countries were experimenting, but they were not so quickly moving to typification and standardization. So here's the T1 that I mentioned to you before, the very first experimental housing type. And eventually the one that gets repeated the most is the T12. But they try out T1 to, the T11 is another one that you'll see. So T1 to 10 are abandoned, and then T11 and 12 are built a lot. And these are modest, modern apartments. They're single family per unit. You don't see any of the Soviet Union kind of communal apartments in Czechoslovakia. Here's an example of an unrenovated T-series building from the late 1940s in Ostrovo Bielski Les, just to be able to see the kind of architecture that they're making. Obviously, this is 50 years later, more than that. It's in rundown condition, but these are simple, functional, modern to a certain degree, but they all have pitched roofs. So this is a kind of communication to say that this is not avant-garde modernism. Friglova's buildings in Ostrovo were supposed to have a flat roof, for example. Okay, so socialist realism. The argument that I make in my book and all of my work is that the real change in Czech architecture and Slovak architecture came in 1950, more than 1948. We can say that 48 has social and economic consequences, of course, but in architectural practice, those first 2 years were very optimistic, and the architects thought that they were actually getting what they had been asking for a long time. But in late 1949, you start to see a pressure coming. Pictures of Soviet architecture start showing up a lot in the journals. Exhibitions coming from Moscow showing all of the great socialist realist architecture of the Soviet Union start coming. And here, for example, we have a picture of central Leningrad from Architectura 1949. And what's being pushed is a method. The argument is not copy Soviet architecture. The argument is copy the method that the Soviets used. And what the way that they talked about this was national in form, socialist in content. So you're making revolutionary architecture, but it's referencing national examples, national history. It's using motifs that are from the local context. So they also start to send architects to the Soviet Union, sometimes willingly or really pushed to have to go. Here we have 5 architects, 2 Slovaks, 3 Czechs, and they are sent on a long trip in 1952, and they're required to report back by publishing in the journal Architektura ČSR. And if you're interested in this and you look at Architektura ČSR from this year, you'll see all these funny photos of the group of 5 with their Soviet handlers in all different places. And I say it's sort of like the Where's Waldo kind of thing. But, you know, in front of a building in Stalingrad, inside the Moscow metro, you know, they're showing them in all these highlights. And the articles that they write are really interesting because they're able to be a little bit critical of what they're seeing, but only in the context of making sure to constantly praise overall the project that's happening in the Soviet Union. So this is the Soviet context comes in as a model, and they are pushed to use this model and method to create new kinds of Czech and Slovak architecture. So for example, we have at the top the project for a new army headquarters, 1954. This was originally going to go on the circle in Davice. If you know that area where the Davice metro station is, there's a whole urban redevelopment project, and originally there was going to be a tower right around the circle for an army headquarters. It doesn't get built. But what does get built is the hotel at Podbaba, that some of you may know, was the Hotel International. It's changed hands. I think the last time I checked it was a Westin or something like that, or an Intercontinental, but it's still a hotel. It was originally meant to be for army. It was going to be another army building, but it very quickly turned into the hotel where they put the important foreign dignitaries. So if somebody came from the Soviet Union or another one of the countries, they were put up in this hotel. It's extremely, extremely well built and has beautiful textiles, beautiful materials, lots of marble. Architects in Prague, when I was there, it's already now 15 years ago, but they were doing tours of the building, and they were really talking about the total work of art that this building was, because the level of craft was so high. But of course, the building has this Soviet impression. People think of it as a Soviet building. It was done by Czech architects, of course. So the other thing that happens is a new journal. So you have Architektura ČSR on one side, which is the magazine of the Architects Union, and a new journal shows up in 1953 as the first editions, I think, and it's called Sovětská architektura, Soviet architecture, and it's meant in Czech to make sure that they know all about what's happening in contemporary Soviet architecture, because of course the generation of architects at that time didn't know Russian, right? There wasn't time to teach them Russian, so they needed it in Czech. So here we have one of the Seven Sisters, if you know them in Moscow. This is a sketch for one of the variants of this new building. The Seven Sisters in Moscow are these 7 wedding cake skyscrapers, and most people think they're from the 30s. They're actually from the early 50s. So these were being built at the time. And the other thing that's important to say is that there's this really, the stress on the method. So the argument is that what Czech architects and Slovak architects should be doing is not copying Soviet buildings, but looking into Czech national history for motifs and inspiration that can become the content, this national form of these buildings. So we have here the famous Litomyšl castle, and you can see here on the left, this is a picture from the journal of Litomyšl. It's a 16th century building, very famous. And then here on the right, you can see examples of how Sorella architecture, this prefabricated, industrialized, socialist realist architecture, picks up the motifs from the building in Litomyšl in the way that the roof lines are done in what's called sgraffito, which is a certain technique of stuccoing with pictures on the building. And these are meant to show the potential in Czech history, the Czech Renaissance in particular, to find motifs for socialist realism. So this is also the period of Poruba. If anybody knows Ostrava, there's a district there was originally going to be called New Socialist Ostrava, and then New Ostrava, and then the name changes to Poruba, and only a portion of this district is built. Sort of in the center, that piece gets done, the rest of it doesn't happen. But the original idea, this is for me so fascinating, is that since the Middle Ages, they've been talking about building a canal to connect the Oder and the Danube rivers. And the Nazis had picked this idea up as well, and they were talking about it, and then the communists were talking about it. and the plan was for that canal to pass by Poruba, and that is the river that you see here. There is no river there, but this was going to be the Oder Dunaj Canal, and it was going to create a waterfront. And there's these great pictures of this big skyscraper with a waterfront in front of it. And this was going to replace the historic center of Ostrava. That was the original plan. And that never happened for many reasons, but they had discovered that there was coal underneath the medieval center of Ostrava, and they wanted the coal. So they thought they were going to tear it all down and move the people, like they did, if you know the situation in Most. And they decided not to do it, but this becomes a residential district and houses 1/3 of the people in Ostrava starting by the 70s. So these are the original designs for Poruba. These are done in a Soviet-inspired way. The scale is very big, the buildings are very tall. This is not how it actually gets built. This is Poruba in about 1956, and I don't have time to get into all the stylistic details, but if you've ever been there, you know that it's considered to be the best example of neighborhood scale socialist realism, and it also is really influenced by Red Vienna. So these architects were really educated in the Viennese 1920s social housing that had been built by the Red government in Vienna. And so there's all these beautiful courtyards, there's all these pass-throughs in the building, and it's very classical in nature. There's a lot of symmetries. Then you also have this big arch building in the front called the Oblok, and this is the gateway into Poruba. So here are some of the examples of how this method of socialist realism is used. We have Schwarzenberg Palace from the Hrad district, Hradčany, from the 1560s. So again, a Czech Renaissance building. You can see the tower at the top of the roof line. And then here we have the Poruba towers that are using that same roof line. And these were shown together in Architektura ČSR as an example of how you would apply this. I think that date is off by a few years, but the point is that the method is about taking these national monuments, these beautiful Czech Renaissance buildings, and building them into the local variation of socialist realism. So now I want to talk about Jiří Krouha. So here we have Jiří Krouha on the far left, Gottwald in the center, and Prime Minister Zapotocki to the right of them. This is at the Slovak Agricultural Exhibition in Prague, which was planned before the communist takeover, but happened after the government was communist. And here we have Krouha sitting with them because he has done most of the architectural work to transform the Výstaviště in Prague into the Slovak Agricultural Exhibition. And from this point forward, Krouha is Gottwald's choice to do these kinds of architectural projects. Here's the stage design for the 9th Party Congress in 1949, and you can see all the pictures of Stalin and Gottwald up there. And this, the setting and the way the trusses are handled, the stage, the way the ceiling is handled, this is all by Jiří Krouha. He was given his own atelier within Stavoprojekt, the only person ever to have his own atelier. It was called the Atelier of National Artist Jiří Krouha. And he was given projects like this, 1951, the Morphology Pavilion at the Medical College of Pulaski University in Olomouc. And this building actually is there, and I visited it, and most people had no idea that it ever even was built because it's never talked about. But this is Krouha's office, early 1950s, doing a kind of hybrid style of socialist realism, but also very much embedded in kind of 19th century neoclassical architecture, and beautifully done. Whatever you think about the politics and the style, the quality of the building is very high. So the other project that he does that the Slovaks in the room, or the people who are more familiar with Slovakia might know, is Nova Dubnica in Slovakia. This is right next to Dubnica nad Váhom, which is in the western part of Slovakia. And this is near an ammunitions plant. There was some kind of new factory that they put in, and they needed a place to house people. So Jiří Krouha's national atelier is hired to be the designers of this new town that they call New Dubnica, Nova Dubnica. And here you can see the ensembles again, the courtyard buildings, these kind of Viennese-inspired buildings once again. This is what the actual architecture looks like. It's fascinating. I was there in the winter and the end of the day, so the pictures came out with a lot of high contrast shadows. but they're the best ones that I have. These are from about 15 years ago now, but they show you that the architecture has arcades. It has multiple levels of residential and commercial in the city center. He did these amazing palace-style buildings. These were for single men. These were svobodarní, and the towers on them are these very unusual style. Nobody knows really where they come from. There's a little hint that he was looking at the Slovak villages right around there and pulling some details and then kind of using them in the buildings. So I have some of that in the book as well. But you can see that there's almost an Asian inspiration in the top of the tower with this all glass piece that you can see in the top image. Here's the another T20. This is facing this other building, another example. This is obviously from around 1955, so it looks different because it's not in its current state, but you can see again that it has this very unusual tower with this oversized pinnacle on it, and very kind of unusual detailing in the centerpiece. And so Proha comes up with what I call, and everybody thinks is a kind of idiosyncratic way of thinking about socialist realism. So here's a close-up of that, and it's just not, you can't categorize this really as anything. We don't really know where it comes from, but it's clearly a series of references that he's putting together in a new way. And he was a big defender of this method of socialist realism, not copying Soviet architecture, not copying neoclassicism, but using the national heritage and the vernacular as inspiration. So he also is hired to do some work in this model housing development that never was finished. He puts in these new buildings to enhance the original model housing development, and they serve as gates. You can see that the building has a taller section to the left on this side and then a lower section, and this is the right gate in the upper picture. This creates a little bit of a monumental entrance into the neighborhood. Here is a department store that he built on the square in Ostrava Bielski Les. And it says /Stalingrad because in 1950 they changed the name of the neighborhood from Bielski Les, which is the name of a local forest, to Stalingrad. And it stayed Ostrava Stalingrad until 1961 when they changed the name back to Bielski Les. So when this was built, it was Ostrava Stalingrad. And this is a department store that's next to the House of Culture. This is an old archival photo. Here's a more contemporary picture of the House of Culture that's right next to the department store. And until very recently, the department store still functioned in the way that something like Kotva did. There were many different small operations inside of it. I think it's slowly starting to really fade, but this House of Culture is booming. It's the place that everybody wants to have their parties and their weddings and their ceremonies. And it's really turned into a business. It has a hotel on the upper floors. Okay, so the final chapter. So here we have the origins of prefabrication. And I start the story by saying that in Germany, in the 1920s, we already have experiments and ideas about building buildings using prefabricated panels. On the left, we have the famous project from Ernst May at Frauenheim in Frankfurt. On the right, we have the Bronze system, which is a commercial system that you would buy this technology from Berlin. And in both cases, they had not solved the structural problem of building more than 2 stories. So these panel buildings in Germany, they did not have the same structural system and structural logic of what eventually would become the Panelák in the Czechoslovak case and the Plattenbau in East Germany. So the zoom ahead to 1941. Here we are in Zlín. It's during World War II. There is an office in the corporation, which is now in the hands of German overseers, and the wife of Tomáš Báťa, the widow, stays behind in Zlín, and she actually brings to Zlín a lot of specialists. They called it a little university during the war. She brought a lot of science